Hello and welcome to Procademy classes. In this video, we are going to learn about services in Angular and dependency injection concept in depth. To explain the concepts of the services and dependency injection, I have tried to keep things simple with easy to understand examples. You can also find the link of the startup project and final solution in the description to practice along with me. In this video, I am going to cover following topics. First of all, we will see what is a service in Angular and when do we use it. Then we will also learn how to create a service in Angular and how to use it in your Angular application. We will also learn what is dependency injection and how to use dependency injection in Angular. We will also learn what is hierarchical dependency injection and how Angular provides hierarchical dependency injection. We will see how we can inject a service into another service. We will also talk about what is injection token in Angular and how to create and use an injection token. And finally, we will also learn how we can use services to pass data from one component to another component. After you finish this video, you will have an in-depth knowledge of what is services and dependency injection in Angular and how to use them in your Angular application. So let's get started with Angular services and dependency injection, and I hope you will find this video helpful and entertaining. So far in this course, we have learned about components and directives in great detail, and we learned that components and directives are the fundamental building block of an Angular application. Another very important feature of Angular is services. So in this lecture, we are going to understand what is a service in Angular and what is its use. So let's see a use case where a service can be helpful, and then we will talk about services and what is the advantage of using a service. Let's say we are developing a simple Angular application where a user can subscribe to the service that the application provides. Here, I'm showing a portion of that application. Now, in this application, we have three main components. So if we separate those components, you will notice that here we have a header component, we have another component, and we also have a third component. And in each of these three components, we have a subscribe button. So in the header component also we have a subscribe button. In this second component also we have a subscribe button. And in this third component also we have a subscribe button. And all these three subscribe buttons are going to do the same thing. It is going to subscribe the user to the web application. Now, in order to subscribe the user, we need to write the subscription logic. And that subscription logic will be executed whenever one of these subscribe buttons are clicked. For example, when the subscribe button is clicked, we might want to call a method called onSubscribe, which will contain the subscription logic. And when this method is called, we will subscribe the user to the application and also send a mail to the user with the subscription details. Now, since we have this subscribe button in three different components and these components are independent of each other, we will have to write the subscription logic in all these three components. And if we have any other component like this where we want to show the subscribe button, in that component also we will have to write the same subscription logic. Now, there are several disadvantages with this approach. First of all, since we are going to write the same code for subscription logic in all three components, here we are repeating the code. And this approach violates the dry principle. That means do not repeat yourself. Here we are repeating the same logic, we are repeating the same code in three different component classes. Another problem with this approach is that we know that we use component to create a UI and define UI logics. So components should only focus on showing UI to the user. But when we write the subscription logic in the component class, subscription logic has nothing to do with the UI. It is a business logic. So here we are mixing business logic with the UI logic. And that is not a good programming approach. So to avoid all these problems, it would be great if we can write the subscription logic in a separate centralized file which can be accessed by all the components. So whichever component want to use the subscription logic, it can directly call the subscription logic written in the centralized file. And we can achieve this using services in Angular. So in this example, what we can do is we can create a service. We can call it maybe subscribe service. And in that subscribe service, we will write the subscription logic. And whichever component would want to use that subscription logic, it can use the subscribe service for that. In this example, we want to use the subscription logic in this header component where we have this subscribe button. We also want to use the subscription logic in this component. Here also we have the subscribe button. And we want to use this subscription logic in this third component as well. So now, instead of writing that subscription logic separately in each of these components, we have written that subscription logic in a service class. And whichever component want to use that subscription logic, it can directly access it from that service class. In this way, we will have a single copy of that subscription logic which can be reused throughout the Angular application. Now, the advantage of this approach is that services allows us to reuse a piece of code in multiple components wherever it is required. In this way, we avoid repeating a piece of code again and again. And it also allows us to separate business logic from UI logic. We write UI logic in the component class and we write our business logic in the service class. In this way, it provides separation of concern. Also, we can unit test the business logic written in the service class separately without creating a component. So it also makes testing and debugging easier. So now we have one service class which contains the subscription logic, and whichever component in this Angular application wants to use that subscription logic, it can directly access it from the service class. That component class do not have to implement that subscription logic. It can simply reuse it from the service class. So from this example, we can say that a service is a reusable TypeScript class that can be used in multiple components across our Angular application. So a service in Angular allows us to reuse a code in multiple places in our Angular application. And a service also allows us to separate the UI logic from the business logic. We write our UI logic in the component class and we write the business logic in the service class. Let's see another use case where we can use a service. So let's say we are creating an e-commerce application and we are selling some product from this e-commerce application. Now, products are stored in a database, and in order to display those products to the user, we need to make an API call to get the product data. Now, in this application, we have two components where we are displaying the products. So if we separate these components, you will notice that here we have two components, this second component and this third component, where we are displaying the list of products. In this component, we are showing all the products, and in the second component, we are showing only the featured products. So in order to display these products, we need to make an API call to fetch product data. And to make the API call, we need to write the data access logic in our Angular application. Now, without services, we will have to write that data access logic in both of these components where we need to display the product. In this way, again, we will repeat the same code in both the components and we will violate the dry principle. And also, we will be writing business logic in the component class, which is another disadvantage. So again, here we can make use of services and we can define the data access logic in that service class and reuse it in the components where we need it. And in this way, we are using a service to reuse a piece of code at multiple places in our Angular application. And this is the main use of a service in Angular. We use services to define a reusable code in our Angular application. Another use case where we can use a service is when we want to communicate between two non-related components. So let's say we have an Angular application and the component tree of that Angular application looks something like this. So at the top, we have our root component, which is the app component. And in that root component, we have header component, container component, and footer component as its child component. And then the header, container, and footer components have their own child components. Now let's say what we want is, we want to pass data from this search component to this product list component. Now, this search component is not related to this product list component in any way. We have learned how we can pass data from a parent component to child component and from a child component to parent component. For that, we can use custom property binding and custom event binding. But so far, we have not learned how we can pass data from two non-related components. We can surely achieve this by using a combination of custom property binding and custom event binding. But so far, we have not seen any way in which we can directly communicate between two non-related components. But we can achieve this using services. And we are going to see that with an example in this section. So this was a very high level overview of what is a service in Angular and what is its use. In the next lecture, we are going to learn how we can create a service and use it in our Angular application. In the last lecture, we learned what is a service and why we need a service in an Angular application. We learned that a service is a TypeScript class which contains a piece of code which can be reused throughout the Angular application. So a service provides reusability of code in Angular. Now in this lecture, let's go ahead and create a very simple service and use it in our Angular application. For that, I have created a very simple Angular application. This Angular application, it is just like the first example which we saw in our previous lecture. So in this application, we have three main components. The first component is this header component. Then we also have a hero component, this component, and we have a sidebar component. And in each of these three components, we have a subscribe button. So we have a subscribe button in header component, we have a subscribe button in sidebar component, and we also have a subscribe button in hero component. Now here, our requirement is such that whenever one of these subscribe buttons is clicked by the user, we want to subscribe the user to this web application. In simple words, whenever any one of these subscribe buttons is clicked, we want to execute the subscribe logic. So let's first see how we will have to do it without services. Let's go to VS Code, and in there I have created a new project. I'm calling it Angular Service and Dependency Injection. In this project, if I expand this source folder, in there we have our app folder, and in the app folder I have the header component. So first we have app component, and then we have the header component, and the header component is the child component for app component. So if I go to the web page, this component which you see here, it is the header component. If I expand this header component, in there we have two more components. We have admin component and we have home component. So this admin component and home component, it is the child of this header component. Now we will talk about admin component later. We don't need it in this lecture, but let's go to this home component. So if I expand this home component, and this home component, it represents this complete area here after the header. And in that home component, we have two other components. We have a hero component. So this hero component here, it represents the left side of the home component. So basically this content, it is coming from hero component. And then we also have sidebar component. So the sidebar component here is this right hand side content. So this content here, it is coming from sidebar component. Okay, and both sidebar component and hero component, it is the child component of home component. Okay, so hero and sidebar, it is the child component of home component. So in this lecture, we are going to work with three components. We are going to work with header component. So we have a subscribe button within the header component, and we also have a subscribe button in hero component and sidebar component. Now, just to make things easier, I will show you how the component tree of this Angular application looks like. So this is how the component tree of that Angular application looks like. At the top, we have app component. In that app component, we have header component. This header component has two child components, the home component and the admin component. And then the home component has two child components, hero component and sidebar component. And this admin component has one child component, this user detail component. Now we will talk about this admin component and user detail component in the future lecture of this course. Let's now focus on this header component and also on the hero and sidebar component. So we saw that we have the subscribe button in this header component, and we also have subscribe buttons in this hero component and this sidebar component. So first, let's go ahead and let's implement the subscription logic for the subscribe button of header component. Let's go to VS Code. In there, let's go to header component and let's go to header component.html. So what we want is, when this subscribe button is clicked, we want to execute subscription logic. So on this button, we are going to bind click event. And we have that button here. So on this button, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. And when the click event happens, I'm going to call a method on subscribe. Now let's go ahead and let's create this method in the header component class. So let's open header component class. In there, we already have two methods, home clicked and admin clicked. Now we will not worry about it right now. Let's go ahead and let's create on subscribe method. And when the subscribe button is clicked, we want to execute some subscribe logic. In that subscribe logic, we might want to add the user to the database. Then we might want to send subscription email with the subscription details to the user. Then we might also want to allow user to access our services. For example, let's say if we are creating a streaming service, like Netflix, then once the user has subscribed, we might also want to allow the user to go through the movies or TV series which he wants to watch. So that is the service Netflix is providing. So once we have added the user to the database, we have sent the subscription detail to the user, then we also want to allow user to access the services. Now here I'm not going to write the logic for these steps. These logics we are not going to write because here in this lecture our main focus is to understand how we can create a service and what is the advantage of using a service. Right, in this lecture we are not going to worry about adding the user to the database or sending him the email or anything like that. Here we are mainly going to focus on what is a service and how we can use it. So to keep things simple, what I will do is, after the logic of adding the user to the database, sending email to the user, and allowing user to access the service, after all these logics have been executed, we also want to show the user a notification saying that you have been subscribed. For that, I'm simply going to use this alert function, and I want to show that message to the user using the alert window. So here I'll simply say, thank you for subscribing. You can access the services now. Okay. So if I save the changes here, and if we go to the web page now, and if I click on the subscribe button, you will notice that an alert window has been displayed here with the message, thank you for subscribing. You can access the services now. So here, when the subscribe button is clicked, we are executing the subscription logic. Now we want to do the same thing for these two buttons as well. So when this subscribe button is clicked, that time also we want to execute the subscription logic and show the alert window. And when this subscribe button is clicked, that time also we want to subscribe the user and we want to show the alert window. But currently these two buttons are not working. So for that, what we need to do is, again, we need to bind click event on these two buttons and then write the same logic and execute it. So this subscribe now button is present in hero component. Now, if I go back to VS Code and if I open hero component, for that we have to go to home component, and in there we have the hero component. Okay, so in the hero component also, we need to write the same logic. So I'll copy this function from here. Let's close this header component and let's open hero component.html. And there also we have this subscribe button. On that button, first we need to bind the click event. Okay, and to that click event, we are going to call on subscribe method. And let's go to hero component.ts, and in there, let's go ahead and let's create that method. So if you notice here also, we are writing the same logic which we have written in the header component. So here we have the same onSubscribe method. In that onSubscribe method, we are executing the same logic of subscription. And whenever the subscribe button of hero component will be clicked, we are calling that onSubscribe method. So if I go back to the web page, now this subscribe now button should also be working. So when I click on the subscribe now button, now you can see we have this alert window with the message, thank you for subscribing, you can access the services now. If I click on this subscribe button, there also we have the same message. Let's do the same thing for this subscribe now button. Now this subscribe now button is present in sidebar component. So let's again go back to VS Code. Let me close this hero component.html here, and let's open sidebar component. So again, I'll open the HTML file first. There on the button element, let's bind click event. And to this click event, we are going to bind on subscribe method. And let's go ahead and let's create this method in the sidebar component class. And you will notice that we are writing the same subscribe logic in the sidebar component also. With this, we save the changes. If we go to the web page, now this subscribe button should also be working. So when I click here, you can see that an alert window with the same message that has been displayed here. So now for all these three buttons, we are executing the subscribe logic. Okay, but the problem here is if I go back to VS Code, let me close this HTML file here, and let me also open header.ts file. So you will notice that in the header component class, we have the same subscription logic. In the sidebar class, we have the same subscription logic. And in the hero component class also, we have the same subscription logic. So here we are repeating the same logic in three different components. And in this way, we are violating the dry principle. That means do not repeat yourself. And this is not an efficient way of developing the application. In this example, we have only three components where we need the subscription logic. But let's say in our application, there are some more components where we need to use that same subscription logic. Then we will have to write that subscription logic again in those component classes. And again, we will be repeating the same code. So this is a very big problem here. Here, we are violating the dry principle. We are repeating the same code again and again in our Angular application. Another problem is, as we learned in the last lecture, in the component class, we should be only writing the UI logics. We should not be writing the business logic. But this onSubscribe method, it contains a business logic. It has nothing to do with the UI. So here we are mixing the UI logic with the business logic. And that is another bad practice while developing a front-end application. Now, to solve this problem, what we can do is we can make use of services. So let's go ahead and let's create a simple service and let's see how it allows us to solve all these problems. So let me go ahead and let me retract these folders. Okay. And in the app folder, I'm going to create a new folder. I'll call this folder services. Inside this services folder, I'm going to create a new service file. I'm going to call this service file subscribe.service. So the convention here while creating a service file is that your service file must contain .service. So when we create a component, we say component name dot component. When we create a directive, we use directive name dot directive. In the same way, when we create a service, we should have the service name dot service. And then a service file is nothing but a TypeScript file. So here the extension should be .ts. Now in the last lecture we learned that a service is nothing but a TypeScript class. So in order to create a service, all we have to do is we have to create a class. So let's go ahead and let's create a class. For that we can use this class keyword and we are going to call this class subscribe service. And we also want to use this class in other files. For that we also need to export it. Now, when we create a component, we decorate it with @component decorator. When we create a directive, we decorate it with @directive decorator. But in case of a service class, we do not decorate it with any decorator. A service class is just a simple TypeScript class. And inside this class, we can write all those logics which we might reuse in our Angular application. For example, this subscribe logic. So let me go ahead and let me copy this logic from here and I will write this logic inside the subscribe service class. Okay. In the same way, in this subscribe service, we can also write other subscription related logic. For example, on unsubscribe or maybe renew subscription, something like that. But for now, we are going to only keep one method, this onSubscribe method. And actually, I'm going to call it onSubscribe clicked. Okay, so when the subscribe button is clicked, that time only we want to execute this logic and then we want to show this alert window. Now we have a subscribe service class. In that subscribe service class, we have this onSubscribe clicked method which contains the subscription logic. So now what we can do is we can reuse this onSubscribe clicked method in all those components where we need to execute the subscription logic. For example, if I go to this header component class, there we need to execute the subscription logic. So instead of writing that subscription logic here, what I will do is I will remove this subscription logic from here. And in here, I will instantiate this subscribe service class. And to instantiate that subscribe service class, let's create a variable. Let's call it maybe subservice. And in order to instantiate a class, in order to create an object of a class, first we use new keyword followed by the class name. Now here, the class name is subscribe service. And in order to use this subscribe service, we also need to import it from this subscribe service file. So when I press enter, it will be automatically imported at the top. And after the class name, we need to use a set of parentheses. Okay, so in this way, we are creating an instance of the subscribe service class. And once we have an instance of that subscribe service class, on that instance, we can go ahead and we can call this onSubscribe clicked method. So in here, I can simply say subservice dot onSubscribe clicked. Currently, this subscribe service method, it is not taking any parameters. So that's why we are not passing any argument here. But a service method can also take some parameter. And just to show you that, what I will do is I will also include a parameter here, maybe type. It is going to be of type string. This is not required, but I just want to show you here that we can also pass parameter to the service method. Okay, so here we are going to receive the type, and here I'm going to use that type parameter in this alert message. So here I will say thank you for your, and then I'm going to use the type parameter here, and after that I'll say subscription. Okay, now when we are calling this on subscribe clicked method from the header component, we need to pass a value for this type parameter. So there I am going to pass a string value, maybe monthly. If I save the changes, if you go to the web page, and now when I click on this subscribe button, what it will do is, since to this subscribe button we have binded click event. So if I open header component.html, there we are binding this click event, and when the click event happens, we are going to call this on subscribe method. If I go to header component class, there we are defining this on subscribe method. So when this on subscribe method will be called, first it will create an instance of the subscribe service class, and then it is going to call the on subscribe clicked method of that subscribe service class. And to that method, we are passing the value for the type parameter as monthly. So again, if we go back and if we click on this subscribe button, you will notice that the message says, thank you for your monthly subscription. You can access these services now. Okay. Now let's go ahead and let's do the same thing for this subscribe now button of hero component. So let's go back. Let me copy these two lines of code, and let me close this header component.html, and let's go to this hero component.ts. And in there, from this on subscribe method, I will remove all these subscription logics. Now we are going to use the subscription logic from the subscribe service class. But in order to use that subscription logic in this hero component class, first we need to instantiate the subscribe service class. And in order to use this subscribe service class inside this hero component, we also need to import it. So I'll also go ahead and I'll copy that import statement. Okay. And let me go ahead and let me paste it here. Now here, currently we are in the hero component, right? And hero component is present inside the home component. So when we say dot dot slash, from the hero component, we have moved to home component. Now from the home component, we also need to move to header component. And from the header component, we need to move to app component. And then in the app component, in the app folder, we have this service folder. And in there, we have the subscribe service. Okay, so now we are able to access this subscribe service class from this file. So when the subscribe button will be clicked, this on subscribe method will be called. There we are creating an instance of this subscribe service, and on that instance we are calling this on subscribe clicked method, and there we are passing a value for the type parameter. But here, instead of saying monthly, let's say yearly. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page, and now this subscribe button should also be working. So if I click on this subscribe button now, it says thank you for your yearly subscription. So this yearly, we passed it as an argument for the type parameter. When I click on this subscribe button, it says thank you for your monthly subscription. All right, now let's do the same thing for this third subscribe button as well. So again, let's go back and let's copy these two lines of code. Let's go to sidebar component, and from there, from the on subscribe method, let's remove this subscription logic, because now we are going to use this subscription logic from the subscribe service. And in order to reuse that logic, first we need to create an instance of this subscribe service class, and then on that instance we can call this on subscribe clicked method. Again, in order to use this subscribe service class, we need to first import it. So again, I'll copy this import statement. I'll go back to sidebar component, and there I'll paste it. Okay, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and here for the type parameter, instead of saying yearly, let me pass quarterly. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page, and now when I click on this subscribe button, it says thank you for your quarterly subscription. So now the subscription logic is getting executed for this subscribe button also. Okay, so what we are doing here is, whenever any one of these three subscribe buttons is clicked, we are going to execute a subscription logic. And we are writing that subscription logic in the subscribe service class in here. And then we are reusing this logic, this piece of code in hero component. We are reusing it in side component, and we are reusing it in header component. We are not writing the subscription logic in the component class now. We are writing it in the service class. And then we are reusing that logic in different components. And this is the main use of a service. A service in Angular allows us to reuse a piece of code. And when we have used a service class like this, we have also separated the business logic from the UI logic. So now we are not writing any business logic in the component class. Component class now, it only contains the UI logic. Alright, so I hope with this simple example, now it is clear to you what is a service and what do we use a service for. Now, before I wrap up this lecture, there is one more thing which I want to talk about here. So here, if you notice in these components, for example, in this hero component, in this sidebar component, and in this header component, in order to reuse the onSubscribe clicked method of the subscribe service, what we are doing is we are creating an instance of subscribe service class. And once we have that instance created, on that instance, we are calling the onSubscribe clicked method. Now, when we are creating an instance of this subscribe service class by our own in this hero component class, what we are doing is we are making this hero component class dependent on this subscribe service class. So if for some reason the subscribe service class is removed or it is modified, it will affect this hero component class. In that case, this hero component class might not work properly. So here, when we are explicitly instantiating this service class, we are making the component class tightly coupled with that service class. And it is not a good practice. Instead, what we can do here is we can ask Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class to this hero component class. And we can use that injected instance. Instead of creating an instance by ourselves, we can ask Angular to provide an instance of this service class, and then we can use that instance in this component class. And that is called as dependency injection. So in the next lecture, we will see what is dependency injection and how we can ask Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this hero component as well as inside the sidebar component and header component. In this lecture, let's learn what is dependency injection in Angular and what advantage does it provides. Dependency injection or DI is one of the fundamental concepts of Angular. Dependency injection is wired into the Angular framework and it allows classes to configure dependencies that they need. So before we talk about dependency injection, let's first try to understand what a dependency is. A dependency is a relationship between two software components where one component relies on other component to work properly. Let's try to understand this definition of dependency using our Angular application. So in the last lecture, we created this subscribe service class and we are using this subscribe service class in the header component. We are using it in the hero component and we are also using it in the sidebar component. So here what we are doing is, if I take example of the sidebar component, in the sidebar component, we are creating an instance of this subscribe service class. And then using that instance, we are accessing this onSubscribe click method of that subscribe service class. So in this example, this sidebar component, it is dependent on this subscribe service class. For this sidebar component to work properly, it has a dependency on this subscribe service class. So in this example, this subscribe service, it is a dependency of this sidebar component. In the same way, if I go to hero component, there also we are creating an instance of this subscribe service class. So this hero component, it is dependent on this subscribe service class in order to work properly. So here also, this subscribe service is a dependency for this hero component class. In the same way, the subscribe service is also a dependency for this header component class. Now, inside this header component class, also inside this hero component class and this sidebar component class, what we are doing is we are explicitly creating an instance of this subscribe service class. So at this line, we are creating an instance of subscribe service class by calling the constructor of this subscribe service class. And when we are doing so, we are making this component class, in this example, this sidebar component class, tightly coupled with this subscribe service class. Now, tight coupling is not good because it reduces the flexibility and reusability of the code. For example, let's say if this subscribe service class changes, it will affect this sidebar component also because the sidebar component class is tightly coupled with this subscribe service class. So if anything changes inside this subscribe service class, it might impact this sidebar component class. In the same way, if anything changes in this subscribe service class, it might also affect this hero component class because here the hero component class is also tightly coupled with this subscribe service class. And same is the case for the header component class also. Here also, if something changes in the subscribe service class, it might affect the functionality of header component class. For example, if I go to this subscribe service class, currently we don't have any constructor for the subscribe service class. So here, in order to create an instance of the subscribe service class, we are using the parameterless constructor. Okay, so if you remember, we have talked about this, that if we don't specify a constructor for a class, by default, it gets a parameterless constructor. And using that parameterless constructor, we create the instance of that class. But it is also possible for us to specify a constructor explicitly. So here what I will do is, I'll go ahead and create a constructor for the subscribe service class. Okay, and this constructor, it is also a parameterless constructor. So now this constructor will be called in order to instantiate the subscribe service class. But if we go ahead and if we specify a parameter for this constructor, for example, let's say name, this is just for demo purpose. Now what will happen is, whenever we will have to instantiate this subscribe service class, we will have to call this constructor. And this constructor is taking a name parameter. So here we have modified this subscribe service class. And when we have modified this subscribe service class, you see in all these three components, we have an error. So at the line where we are instantiating this subscribe service class, there we have an error. Because now the constructor of this subscribe service class, it is expecting a value for its name parameter. So in this way, when we have changed something inside this subscribe service class, it has broke the functionality of this header component, this hero component, and this sidebar component. And that's what I mean when I say that here the component class is tightly coupled with this subscribe service class. Anything changes in the subscribe service class, it might affect the functionality of this component class. Let's go back to subscribe service class, and from there, for now, let's remove this constructor. So the disadvantage with tight coupling is that the class is not very flexible. Since the component class is tightly coupled with the service class, any changes in the service class might break the functionality in component class. So anytime the dependency changes, the component class also has to be changed accordingly. Another disadvantage is that it makes the testing of the class difficult. Because if the dependency changes, the class has to change. And when the class changes, the unit test, the mock code which we write for unit testing, that also has to change. And to overcome these problems, we can use dependency injection. In a dependency injection, what we do is, instead of instantiating the class by ourselves, we ask Angular to provide an instance of that dependency in that particular class. And we can use that injected instance in order to execute the logic from the service class. For example, here we have this hero component class, and Angular has a tool called injector. And the job of this injector is to inject an instance of a dependency in the class. So here what we want is, we want Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this header component class. As we learned, this subscribe service, it is a dependency of this header component class. So we want Angular injector to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this header component class. For that, first we need to tell Angular how to inject the dependency. In this case, we are using a constructor, and using this constructor, we want Angular to inject the dependency. And we also need to tell Angular what is the dependency we want. That we do using this provider property of this component metadata object. So here in the provider property, we have an array, and in that array, we are specifying the type of dependency which we want Angular to inject inside this header component class. So what this Angular injector will do is it will inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this parameter of the constructor. And then we can use that instance in order to execute the logic from the service class. So in this example, you will notice that nowhere we are instantiating this subscribe service class by our own. Instead, Angular injector is providing us an instance of this subscribe service class inside this header component class. And we are making use of that instance in order to call this onSubscribeClick method. Let's see how we can achieve this practically. So now what we want is, instead of creating an instance of this subscribe service class by our own, we want Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this header component, inside this hero component, and inside this sidebar component. So let's start with this sidebar component. So here what I will do is, first of all, I will remove this line because now we don't want to instantiate the subscribe service class by our own. Now what we want is, we want Angular to inject an instance of the subscribe service class. For that, first we are going to create a constructor because we need to tell Angular how we want the dependency to be injected. For that, we are going to make use of constructor. In this constructor, we will create a parameter. Maybe I'll call it as subservice. You can name it anything. And the type here is going to be subscribe service. Okay, so in this way, we are telling Angular how to inject an instance of this subscribe service class. Angular has to inject an instance using this constructor, and it has to assign that instance to this subservice parameter. Now, this subservice parameter, it will be available only inside this constructor because it will be local to this constructor. So what we want is, behind the scenes, we want to create a private property called subservice so that we can use it throughout this sidebar component class. For that, I'm going to use a private keyword in front of this parameter. And what it will do is, behind the scenes, it will create a private property called subservice. And that property will be assigned with the value which we are going to receive for this subservice parameter. In this case, we are going to receive an instance of subscribe service for this subservice parameter. So that will be assigned to that private property. Now, since it is a private property, we know that in order to access a property, we need to use this keyword. So here we can say this dot subservice, which is the private property, and it stores an instance of this subscribe service class. And on that instance, we are calling this onSubscribeClick method. Now here Angular knows how to inject a dependency. To inject a dependency, it is going to use this constructor. But what dependency it has to inject? Which type of instance Angular has to inject, that Angular does not know yet. So we need to tell Angular about that. For that, here we have this add component decorator. To that, we are passing a metadata object. In that metadata object, we have a property called providers. And this providers stores an array. And inside this array, we can specify the type of all the dependencies which we want Angular to provide for this component class. Currently, we only want one dependency to be injected inside this sidebar component class. And the type of that dependency is subscribe service. Right here, we want an instance of subscribe service class inside this sidebar component. So we are going to tell Angular about that using this providers array. And in that array, we will specify all the types for which we want a dependency. Currently, we have only one dependency, but if you have multiple dependencies, you can also specify them separated by comma like this. And we will see that in our future lectures. All right, so now Angular knows what to provide and how to provide. And this is it. Using this constructor, we are telling Angular how to provide. And using this providers array, we are telling Angular what to provide. And that's it. So let's go ahead and let's do the same thing in the hero component also and in the header component also. I'll copy this constructor from here and I'll go to hero component. There I will specify a constructor. So this constructor is for hero component. And now we are not going to instantiate this subscribe service class explicitly. So I will remove this line. And here we also need to tell Angular what to provide. For that, we need to use providers array. So again, I will copy this line and I will specify a providers array in the metadata of hero component also, like this. And now, since this subservice, it is a property, we need to access it using this keyword. Let's go ahead and let's do the same thing in the header component also. So first of all, I will remove this line of code where we are explicitly instantiating this subscribe service class. I will go ahead and I will create a constructor after this property. Okay. And since it is a property now, we need to access it using this keyword. And now we also need to specify the providers array. So I'll go here, I'll copy this providers array from here with a comment. And let's go ahead and let's specify it here. Let's save the changes. Let's go to our web application and let's just quickly test if these subscribe buttons are still working or not. So when I click on this subscribe button in the header component, here we have the message, thank you for your monthly subscription. This is working. Let's click on this subscribe button of hero component. Here it says, thank you for your yearly subscription. So this is also working. And let's also check this subscribe now button. So when I click on that, here we have the message, thank you for your quarterly subscription. So this subscribe button is also working. So the functionality is still working as expected. The only change which we have done is instead of creating the instance by our own, now we are asking Angular to inject an instance of that subscribe service. So this subscribe service is our dependency. We are telling Angular to inject an instance of this dependency inside this header component class. Same thing we are doing in the hero component. So there also we are asking Angular to provide an instance of this dependency, this subscribe service class inside this hero component. And same thing we are doing in the sidebar component also. So now the sidebar component, it is not tightly coupled with this subscribe service class because now we are not instantiating this subscribe service class explicitly in this sidebar component class. In the same way, this hero component, it is not tightly coupled with this subscribe service class because now we are not instantiating this subscribe service class inside this hero component class. Instead, we are asking Angular to inject an instance of this subscribe service class inside this hero component class. And same is the case for header component. So in simple terms, we can say that dependency injection is a technique, or we can say it is a design pattern using which a class receives its dependencies from an external source rather than creating them itself. And we have seen that with an example. Now, the advantage of this approach is that dependency injection keeps the code flexible, testable, and mutable. Since the component class is no more tightly coupled with the service class, our component class is more flexible, so we can add more functionalities without worrying about the service class, and it is easily testable and mutable. And with dependency injection, we just learned that classes can inherit external logic without knowing how to create it. Right? In our component class, we were not creating an instance of subscribe service, but still we were able to use the on subscribe clicked method of that subscribe service. So there we were able to use the logic of the subscribe service class without creating an instance of subscribe service. And in this way, dependency injection benefits components, directives, and pipes in Angular. In the last lecture, we learned what is dependency injection and how we can use dependency injection in Angular, and also what is the advantage of using a dependency injection. So in our Angular application, we have this subscribe service class, and we injected an instance of this subscribe service class inside this header component, inside this hero component, and inside this sidebar component. And in order to inject the dependency inside these component classes, what we did is first we created a constructor to tell Angular how it needs to provide the dependency. And then we also use this providers array where we are specifying the type of dependency which we want in our class. Now, when we are using this providers array inside this sidebar component class, here we are going to get an instance of this subscribe service class, and that instance will be assigned to this subservice property. In the same way, in this hero component also, here we are using this providers array, and there we have specified the dependency of type subscribe service. So here also we are going to get an instance of this subscribe service class, and that instance will be assigned to this subservice. But the instance which we are going to get for this hero component class, that instance will be different from the instance which we are going to get for the sidebar component. And if I go to header component, there also we are going to get an instance of this subscribe service class. And that instance will be different from the instance which we are going to get for the hero component class and also for the sidebar component class. So in our Angular application, we are providing the service in the header component. There we are using the provider array. We are also providing the service in the hero component and sidebar component. So in the hero component and sidebar component also, we are using the provider array. So what will happen here is when we use provider array and when we specify the type of the dependency which we want, an instance of that dependency will be injected. So in this case, for this header component, an instance of subscribe service will be injected. In the same way, for the hero component also, an instance of subscribe service will be injected. And for the sidebar component also, an instance of subscribe service will be injected. But these three instances will be completely different. That means if you do something with instance 1, it is not going to affect instance 2 and instance 3. If you do something with instance 3, it is not going to affect instance 2 and instance 1. So keep this point in mind. In whichever component we will use the provider array, for that component, we are going to get a unique instance of the dependent service. And this is very important to understand. So when we provide a service on multiple components, each component gets its own instance of that service. Now let's understand what is hierarchical dependency injection in Angular. So when we provide a dependency on a component, the same instance of that dependency is injected in the component class and all its child components and their child components also. And this is called as hierarchical injection. Let's try to understand this with an example. So let's say in the header component, I'm using the provider array. So there I am providing a service. Let's say we are providing the subscribe service. So for the header component, we are going to get an instance of subscribe service. Let's call it sub service. And we are not using providers array in any other child component. So according to hierarchical injection, since we have used the providers array on the header component, an instance of the service will be injected in the header component. And same instance will also get injected in all its child components and their child components. So you see, same instance is also available for the child component of this header component and for their child component as well. And this is called as hierarchical injection. Let's see this practically. So currently we are providing the service in the sidebar component. We are also providing it in the hero component and we are also providing it in header component. But this hero component and the sidebar component, it is child component of this header component. And according to hierarchical injection, if we inject a dependency in the parent component, the same instance of that dependency will be injected to all its child components and their child components. Currently, when we are providing it independently on each of these components, we are going to receive different instances in each of these components. But now what I will do is, I will remove this providers array from hero component. Okay, and I'll also remove it from the sidebar component. But I will keep it on the header component. So in the header component, we will receive an instance of this subscribe service class using this constructor. And same instance will also get injected in the hero component and the sidebar component. Now we are not providing the service in the sidebar component and hero component, but our application should still be working because we are providing the service in the header component. So the same instance of that service will also get injected in the hero component and sidebar component. So our application should still be working. We should still be able to call this onSubscribeClick method on this sub service because in this sub service, we are going to receive an instance of the subscribe service which we are receiving for the header component. I hope this point is clear. So if I go to the web page and if I click the subscribe button of this header component, there we will see this alert window. And if I click on the subscribe now button of this hero component, there also we can see the alert window. And if I click on this subscribe now button, there also we are seeing this alert window. So the functionality is still working. But now, instead of getting a separate instance of this subscribe service class, we are getting the same instance of this subscribe service class which has been injected for this header component. Now we can also override a dependency. So when we provide a dependency on a component and we also provide a dependency on its child component, the child component dependency instance will override its parent component dependency instance. So we learned that when we provide a dependency on the parent component, In this example, let's say I'm providing the dependency in the header component. For the header component, an instance of that dependency will be injected. And same instance will be injected to all its child component and their child component. But let's say I'm providing a service on the parent component and I'm also providing the same service in the child component. For example, here in the hero component also I'm providing the same service. So what will happen is inside this hero component, inside this child component, we will get another instance of that service, and that instance will override the instance which we are receiving from the parent component. And this is another important point which you need to remember. Because if you don't understand this concept properly, then you can introduce some difficult to find bugs. And we will understand that with an example in our next lecture. So remember that child component provider overrides the instance of its parent component provider. Now we can also provide a dependency on the root component. And root component in our example is the app component. So when we provide a dependency on the root component, the same instance of that dependency is injected to all components, directives, and services. So here, let's say we are providing a service on the root component, and the root component in our example is the app component. In that case, an instance of that service will be injected in this app component. Let's say that service is subscribe service. So an instance of the subscribe service will be injected in this app component, and the same instance will also get injected in all its child components, directives, and services. So in this example, currently we have removed the providers array from the sidebar component. We have also removed it from the hero component. Let's also go ahead and let's remove it from the header component. So I will not provide the service here, but somewhere we need to provide the service. Otherwise, Angular will not know what instance it has to provide to this header component class, to this hero component class, and to this sidebar component class. So we are going to provide the service on the app component. So let me go ahead and let me collapse these folders. Okay, and let's go to app component.ts file. And now we are going to provide the service inside this app component. So let's go ahead and let's specify the providers array here. And in here, let's specify the type of dependency as subscribe service. And in order to use this subscribe service, we also need to import it. So now we are providing this subscribe service on the app component. And app component is our root component. So now the same instance of this subscribe service class should be injected in all the components, in all the directives, and also in all the services. So now inside the header component class, inside this hero component class, and inside this sidebar component class, we are going to get the same instance of the subscribe service. So if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, the application should still be working. Okay. If I click on this button, here also we see this alert window. And if I click on this button, here also we see the alert window. So the application is still working, but now we are providing the service on the root component level. And finally, we can also provide a service on the module level. And when we provide a service from the module, in that case, the same instance of the dependency will be available throughout the Angular application. And in this way, we implement singleton pattern where a single instance is shared throughout the application. Here, instead of providing the service on the app component level, let me go ahead and let me remove this providers array from here as well. And now we are going to provide the service from the app module. So let's open this app module.ts file. In there, you will notice that we have this ng module decorator. To that, we are passing some metadata object. And in that metadata object, we have this providers array. And in here, we can specify the type of the dependency which we want to inject to the whole application. Here, we want to inject an instance of subscribe service. So I'll specify it here. And in order to use it, we also need to import it. So now an instance of this subscribe service will be created, and that same instance will be available throughout the application. It will be available in all the components, it will be available in all the directives, and it will also be available in all the services. So if we save the changes now, we have removed this providers array from the app component. Let's go to app component. From there, I have removed the providers array, and we are also not providing the service in the sidebar component. We are not providing it in the hero component, and we are also not providing it in the header component. We are only providing the service from the app module. So if I save the changes, if we go to the web page, our application should still be working. As you can see, the alert window is still opening. If I click on this subscribe button also, it is working. And if I click on this subscribe button, that is also working. So the functionality is still working. But now we are getting the dependency, the instance of the dependency from the app module. And we are getting the same instance of the dependency in all these components, in the header component, in the hero component, and in the sidebar component. We are also getting the same instance in the app component, but there we are not using that instance. So I hope with these examples, the concept of hierarchical dependency injection in Angular is clear to you. In the next lecture, let's see one example of hierarchical dependency injection and what problems it can lead to and how to resolve those problems. In the last lecture, we learned that Angular injects a dependency on a hierarchical basis. That means when we provide a service on a component, Angular will create and inject an instance of that service for that component, and same instance will also get injected for all its child components and their child component. And we also learned that we can override the instance provided by the parent component in the child component. And this can introduce some unforeseen bugs in our Angular application. And that's what we are going to understand in this lecture. So in this Angular application, if I go to app folder, there you will notice that we have this header folder. And in the header folder, we have two components, admin component and home component. If I go to the web page, this is our home component. Okay, this area which you see, this is the home component. In the same way, we also have an admin component. And to see that admin component, I can click on this admin link and it will take us to that admin component. So in the admin component, you will notice that we have two areas. In the first area, we are displaying a form, and in the second area, we are displaying user details. So if I go back to the VS Code and if I open this admin component, in there, if I go to admin component.html, so this HTML which you see here, it is displaying that form in the admin component. And after the form in the admin component, we are using that user list component. And if I go to user list component, for that, I can expand this user list folder. And also this user list is a child component of this admin component. If I expand this user list folder and if I go to user list component.html, there we have a very simple HTML where we are displaying the details of the user. For example, username, his gender, his subscription type, and what is the status of the user. So here we have a very simple HTML, and in here currently we are hard coding these values. But now what we want is we want to create a user service, and that user service should give us a list of users, and using that user service we should also be able to add new users. So let's go ahead and let's create that user service. But before we create a user service, let's first create a model class, a user model class. For that, in the app folder, I will create a new folder. I will call it models. In this models folder, let's go ahead and let's create a new file. And this is going to be a class file, a TypeScript class file. I'm going to call it user and the extension is going to be .ts. In here, I will create and export a new class and I'm going to call this class user. In this class, I want to have four properties. I want to have a name property, which is going to be of type string. I want to have gender property. Again, it is going to be of type string. I'm going to have subscription type property, so I'll call it as subtype. This is also going to be of type string, and I'm going to have status property, and this also is going to be of type string. And for this class, I'm also going to create a constructor, and using that constructor, we should be able to create new users. For this constructor, I'm going to take four parameters. I'm going to take name parameter of type string. I'm going to take gender parameter. It is also going to be of type string, and here it should be string. I'm also going to take subscription type parameter. Again, I'll simply call it as subtype. It is also going to be of type string. And finally, I'm going to take status parameter. And again, it is going to be of type string. Okay, and inside this constructor, we can assign these properties with the value which we are going to receive for these parameters. Okay, so for that we can simply say this dot name equals name, this dot gender equals gender, this dot subtype equals subtype, and this dot status equals status. All right, so this is our user class. Let's save this class. Now let's go ahead and let's create our user service. So in the services folder, I'll create a new service. I'll call it as user service. In here also, I'm going to create and export a new class. I'm going to call this class user service. Inside this class, I'm going to have a users property, and this users property is going to be an array of type user. And in order to use this user class, first we need to import it. Okay, so we are importing user from models folder / user file. All right, now inside this array, we want to have few users. For that, what we are going to do is we are going to call the constructor of the user class, and in there we are going to provide some value for name, gender, subtype, and status parameter. So for the name, I'll say Steve Smith. Let's say his gender is male, subscription type is monthly, and status is active. In the same way, let me go ahead and let me add two more users here. And in order to save some time, I have already created those users. So I'll copy it from here, and let's go ahead and let's paste it here. Okay, so here we have the users array, and in that users array, currently we have 3 users. Now what I want is I want to create a method called getAllUsers, and this method should return all the users from the users array. So let's go ahead and let's create that method. And from here, we are simply going to return this dot users. In the same way, we are also going to have a method called createUser. This createUser method, it is going to take 4 parameters. It is going to take name parameter of type string. It is going to take gender parameter, again of type string. It is going to take subtype parameter, and this is also going to be of type string. And finally, we are going to also have this status parameter, and it is also going to be of type string. Now, what are we going to do inside this create user method? We are going to add a new user with these values inside this users array. So first of all, we will have to create that user. So here I'll create a variable. I'll call it maybe new user, or I will simply call it as user. And to create that user, we are again going to call the constructor of user class. In there, we are going to pass these parameters. So I'll pass name parameter, gender parameter, subtype parameter, and status parameter. And this line here, it will return us a new user with these values. Now we want to add that user inside this users array. So for that, we can say this dot users dot push. So basically, using push method, we can add a new element in an array. This users, it is an array, and inside that array we want to add a new user, right? So the new user should be added at the end of this users array. For that, we are using this push method, and to this method we need to pass the new element which we want to add to the user. In this case, we want to add this new user in the users array, and that's it. So this is our user service. Using this service, we can get all the users, and we can also create new users. So first of all, I'm going to use this service in the user list component. So let me close these folders. Let's go to header folder. In there we have the admin folder, and in there we have our user list folder. So this user list component is basically this part of admin page where we are displaying all the users. Okay, so currently we are displaying a hard-coded user. Now what we are going to do is we are going to loop over this users list inside that user list component, and then we are going to display all the users. So let's go to the HTML file of that user list component, and in there we want to repeat this div. So first of all, let's go to user list component class. In there, let's create a new property, and let's call it maybe user list. And to this user list, I want to assign all the users which we have. And we have all the users in our user service class. So in here, in the user list component, I want to use the users array of the user service. So here we want to use user service class. And in order to use that user service class, we want Angular to inject an instance of that user service. And if you remember from our previous lectures, in order to tell Angular that it has to inject an instance of a service class inside a component class, first of all, in that component class, we create a constructor, because using this constructor, we want Angular to inject an instance. There, we can specify a parameter. Here, the parameter is going to be user service. So I'm calling it user service. You can call it anything, but the type here is going to be user service. If I press enter, you will notice that that class is also imported from this file. And in front of this parameter, I'm going to use private keyword so that behind the scenes, a private property called user service will be created. So here we are telling Angular how to inject the service. But what to inject, we need to tell Angular. For that, if you remember, we use providers array. So here we are specifying the providers array, and in that array, we can specify the service which we want Angular to inject into this user list component class. And in this case, we want Angular to inject an instance of user service inside this user list component class. So in this way, using this instance, now we will have access to this users array and also to this get all users method and to this create user method. So in this class, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that instance, the instance of that user service class. We are calling it user service, and on that, I'm going to call get all users. So this get all users, it is going to return us all the users, and that will be assigned to this user list property. And now what we are going to do is in the view template of this user list component, instead of using the hard-coded value, now we are going to loop over that user list. For that, I'm going to use ng for directive. And in here, let's create a variable. Let's call it user in user list. So the property name here is user list, right? So we want to loop over this user list, which is going to store an array of users. And what do we want to do? We want to display the name of the user here. So here I will use string interpolation syntax and I'll say user.name. In the same way, let's go ahead and let's display other properties. So here we want to display the gender of the user. Then here we want to display the subscription type. So for that we can use the subtype property. And in here we want to display the status of the user. With this, if we save the changes and if we go to the web page and let's go to this admin page, for some reason the users are not being displayed here. Let's open developer console and let's see if we have any error. And we do have an error and it says can't bind to ng for in. All right, that's because instead of in, we need to use of here. So let user of user list. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page. Let's close this developer console. Let's go to this admin page. And now you will notice that all those three users have been rendered here. Okay, so this is our user list component. Now we also have this admin component. And in the admin component, we have this form. And using this form, we want to add new users in our application. Okay, so now let's go to admin component. Let me close this user list component.html here. Let's keep this user list component class open and let's open admin component class. Now in here also we need user service because in this user service only we have this create user method which we want to use in order to add a new user. Okay, so in this admin component also we want Angular to inject an instance of user service class. For that, let's first create a constructor. And inside this constructor, let's specify a parameter. I'll call it user service. You can name it anything, but the type here should be user service. And in order to use this user service class, we also need to import it from this file. And again, I'll use a private keyword in front of this parameter so that behind the scenes, we will have a private property. And the second thing which we need to do is we need to specify the providers array. And inside this providers array, we need to specify the type of the dependency. In this case, the type of the dependency is user service. So in this way, in this admin component class also, we will have access to the user service. Now what do we want to do is, whenever a user enters some value in these fields, let's go to the admin page again. So let's say I enter maybe John, let's say gender is male, subscription type is quarterly, and status is inactive. As soon as I click on this create button, I want to add a new user with these details in the web page and also in the users array. For that, first of all, what we need to do is we need to create some properties where we are going to store these values. So let's go back to Visual Studio, and inside this admin component class, let's go ahead and let's create some properties. Let's say maybe name property. It is going to be of type string, and initially it is going to be empty string. Then let's also specify gender property. It is going to be of type string, and initially let's say it is male. So the default value is male. Then let's also specify the subscription type. So for that, let's create the subtype property. You can name this property anything. It is going to be of type string. And let's say the default subscription type is yearly. Finally, let's also have the status property. It is also going to be of type string. And let's say default value is active. Okay, so these are the properties in which we want to assign the values which the user is going to enter in the form. Now, to bind these properties, what we are going to do is, in the view template, we are going to use two-way data binding. So on this input element, I'm going to use two-way data binding. For that, I'll use ng model. Okay, and I will bind it to the name property of the admin component class. Now, in order to use this ng model, if you remember, we need to import forms module from the Angular/form. So let's open appmodule.ts, and in the imports array, let's specify forms module. And in order to use this forms module, we need to import it from Angular/forms. And with this, that error should be gone. Let's also go ahead and let's bind these drop-down list. So here also we are going to use two-way data binding, and I'm going to bind this gender with the gender property. Let me go ahead and let me copy this line. And here for this drop-down, I'm going to bind this subscription type drop-down with the subtype property. And in the same way, I'm going to bind this status dropdown with the status property. So here I'm simply using two-way data binding. And finally, once we have all these values, we also want to bind a click event on this button element, on this create button. So whenever the click event happens, we want to execute some logic. So here to this click event, I'm going to assign a method. I'll call it create new user. And let's go ahead and let's create this method in the admin component class. Okay, and in order to create a new user, we are going to call the create user method of user service. So let me first close this file, this admin component.html. Okay, and let's go to admin component.ts file. And in here, what we are going to do is we are going to call the create user method of user service. For that, we can say this dot, and we are going to receive an instance of user service class inside this user service property. So let's use that property, and on that, let's call create user method. Now, when we are calling this create user method, we need to pass the value for name parameter, gender parameter, subtype parameter, and status parameter. For that, we are going to use these properties. So here I'll say this dot name, this dot gender, this dot subtype, and this dot status. Okay, and this should create a new user. Now what I will also do is, after we have created the user, I'll go ahead and I'll log that user in the console. So here I'm going to log this dot user service dot users. So I'm logging the users array of the user service class. All right, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let's go to admin panel. Let's open developer console here, and let me clear everything from the console. Now here I will go ahead and I'll try to create a new user. I will specify a name. Let's say Mary Jane. She is female. Let's say her subscription is quarterly and she's an inactive user. When I click on this create button, in here you will notice that an array with 4 users have been logged. If I expand this array, You will notice that the first three users are the users which we have specified in the user service class. Now, for some reason, for this new user, we are getting default values for name, gender, subscription type, and status property. So you see, here for this user, we have all the default values. So for some reason, the two-way data binding in this admin component.html is not working. And it's not working because when we use ng model, we need to use square brackets, and after that, we also need to wrap it within parentheses like this. And that's what we are missing here. Okay, now let's try it one more time. So let's go back to the web page. Let's go to admin tab. Let me create a new user. Let's say Sarah King. She is a female and subscription type is quarterly and she's an inactive user. Let me first clear the console. And when I click on this create button, again an array has been logged. In that array, we have 4 users. And you will notice that the last user, the fourth user here is Sarah King. So the user which we have just created. But we don't see the details of that user in the user list component. If I go ahead and if I try to create another user, maybe let's say test user, let's say male, subscription type yearly, and status is active. When I create this user, you will notice that now an array with 5 users have been logged, and the last user is test user. So we also have our previous user Sarah King. So here when we are logging the array, we are seeing 5 elements, but in the web page we are only seeing the 3 users. We do not see other 2 users displayed here. And the reason we have this behavior is because currently we are providing the service, the user service, on this user list component and also on this admin component. So in the admin component, we have this providers array. So there we are also providing the user service. And in the user list component also, we are providing the user service. So the instance which we are going to receive for this user list component, that will be different from the instance which we are going to receive for this admin component. So in the admin component, Angular is going to inject an instance of this user service class. That instance will be different from the user service instance which the Angular is going to inject for this user list component class. Okay, and on which instance we are adding the new users? We are adding the new users on the instance which we are going to receive for the admin component. But the instance which we are using to display the users, that instance is the instance which we are going to receive in the user list component. So we are adding the user in a different instance, but we are displaying users from a different instance. And that's why we have that behavior. Let's try to understand this diagrammatically. So currently we are providing the user service on both admin component and the user list component. So Angular will inject an instance of user service in the admin component, and it will also inject an instance of user service in the user list component. But these two instances are completely different. Let's call those instances as subservice 1 and subservice 2. So in the admin component, we are trying to add new users using subservice 1 instance. But in the user list component, we are displaying the user using subservice 2 instance. So when we are adding new users using subservice 1 instance, it is not going to affect the subservice 2 instance. In the subservice 2 instance, the user array still has only 3 elements. But in the subservice 1 instance, the user array now has 5 elements because we added 2 new users, right? So how can we solve this problem? To solve this problem, all we have to do is we need the same instance in the admin component as well as the user list component, so that when that instance will be updated from the admin component, that same updated instance will also reflect in the user list component. And to achieve this, all we have to do is, since this user list component, it is a child component of this admin component, when we are providing the service on the admin component, the same instance will also get injected in the user list component. But then in the user list component, what we are doing is we are overriding that instance by providing a new instance. So if we don't provide this user service here in the user list component, then whatever instance we will receive for this admin component, that same instance will also get injected in the user list component, because user list is a child component of admin component. With this, if we save the changes and if we go to the web page, Let's go to admin tab, and in here, now let me create a new user. So I'll call the user Sarah King. Let's say gender is female, subscription type is quarterly, and she's an inactive user. When I click on this create button, you will notice that now that user has been added here. And in the console also, now an array with 4 users have been logged. Let me clear the console here, and let's try to add one more user, maybe test user. And let's say gender is male, subscription type yearly, and user is active. When I click on this create button, you see that new user is also added here. And those 5 users are also logged here in the console. So now, since we are updating the same instance in the admin component, and we are using the same instance to display the user list in the user list component, now you see our application is working as expected. So now what is happening is, in both admin component and in the user list component, we are receiving the same instance of user service, right? So in the admin component, we are providing the user service. So we are going to receive an instance of this user service in the admin component, and the same instance will be injected to all its child components. In this case, this admin component has only one child component, this user list component. So the same instance will be injected in this user list component, and that instance will be used to display all the users from the users array. Now, the user list, it is going to be same throughout the application. It is not going to change for different components, right? If a new user is added to the user list, then that new user should also be visible throughout the application. So instead of providing this user service in the admin component, what we can do is we can provide it on the root level, or the best place will be to provide this user service in the module class. In that way, same instance of the user service class will be injected throughout the Angular application in all the components, in all the directives, and in all other services. So instead of providing this user service here, as I mentioned, the best place would be to provide this user service in the app module class. So here, let's go to app module class. For that, let's open this app module.ts file, and let's provide that user service here. So in this array, I'll use a comma, and then here we also want to provide user service. And in order to use this user service, we also need to import it from this file. So now, since we are providing this user service only inside this module class, same instance of this user service will be available throughout the Angular application. Same instance will be available in all the components, all the directives, and all the other services. And in this way, we can avoid any such bugs which we have just seen. So if I go to the web page, our application should still be working. Let's go to this admin panel. Let's go ahead and let's add a new user, Sarah King. She's female. Let's say subscription type is quarterly, and she's an inactive user. When I click on this create button, the application is still working. If I go ahead and if I create a new user, maybe test user, gender male, subscription type monthly, and the user is an active user, you see that user has also been added and displayed here. So in this lecture, my main focus was to show you that what happens when you override an instance of a dependency in the child component class. Because if you don't understand this concept properly, you might introduce some bug like that, and you will not be able to find the reason behind that problem unless you understand this concept, the concept of hierarchical injection, and also overriding an instance of a dependency in the child component. But with this lecture, now I hope that concept should be clear to you. In the last couple of lectures, we learned about hierarchical dependency injection in Angular. Now, in this lecture, we are going to learn how to inject a service into another service. And yes, that is also possible. We can inject a service into another service. So let's understand with an example how to inject a service into another service. And to understand that, we are going to create a new service. But before that, let me go ahead and let me remove this console.log statement from here. Okay, now let's go ahead and let's create a new service. For that, in the service folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to create a new service, and I'm going to call this service logger service. Inside this logger service file, let's go ahead and let's create and export a class, and let's call that class logger service. And inside this logger service class, I'm going to create a single method and I'm going to call that method log message. Basically, using this logger service, we are going to log error messages or maybe information or something like that. And in order to keep things simple, we are going to log it in the developer console. Instead of logging it in a file or in a database, we are simply going to log messages in the developer console. For that, let me go ahead and let me use console.log statement here. And what I want is for this log message method, I want to specify a name parameter and also the status parameter. And in the console.log statement, I'll use this backticks so that we can use the template literal syntax here. And here I will say a new user with name, and then I'm going to use the name parameter. So here I'm using the template literal syntax. So this is a JavaScript feature. It is not related to Angular. And then I will say with status, and then I'll also use the status parameter here is added to user list. Okay. So every time a new user gets added, we want to log this message in the developer console. Now, where are we adding the user? We are adding the user inside this user service. So in the user service, we have this method called create user. And in there, we are adding a new user. And what we want is once the user is added to the user list, after that, we want to call this log message method of this log service class. And to do that, what we will have to do is first, we will have to instantiate this logger service class inside this user service. And then on that instance, we can call this log message method. But as we learned earlier, if I go ahead and if I instantiate this logger service class inside this user service explicitly, for example, if I go ahead and create a variable, let's say logger, new log service like this. Here we are instantiating this logger service class explicitly. And on that instance, we can simply go ahead and we can call log message method. And there we need to pass value for name parameter. So here I will pass name, this name, which we are going to receive for this create user method. And then we are also going to pass the status. So this status we are going to receive in the status parameter. Okay, if I save the changes, if we go to the web page, let's go to this admin section. Let me open developer console. Let me clear everything here. And if we go ahead and if we add a new user, let's say John. Okay, when I click on this create button, a new user has been added. And in here, you will also see the message, a new user with name John with status active is added to user list. If I create some other user, maybe Mary, if I change the gender to female, subscription type to quarterly, and let's say she's an active user. When I click on this create button, you will notice that another log message, a new user with name Mary with status active is added to user list. And those users are also added here in the user list. Okay, so this functionality is working as expected. But here again, we are explicitly creating an instance of this logger service class. And in this way, we are making this user service tightly coupled with this logger service class. And this is not a good programming practice. We have already seen that. So what we want is instead of creating an instance of this logger service class explicitly, we want Angular to inject an instance of this logger service class inside this user service class. For that, we need to do three things. So first of all, I will go ahead and I will comment this line. Okay. Now we need to tell Angular how it needs to inject an instance of the logger service. For that, we are going to create a constructor. So after this user array, I'll specify a constructor here. And inside that constructor, we will create a parameter. And I'll simply call it as logger. And it is going to be of type logger service. And here in front of this parameter, I'll use this private keyword so that behind the scenes, a private property called logger will be created. Okay, so this is the first step. Here we are telling Angular how to inject an instance of this logger service class inside this user service. So now Angular know how to inject this service, but we also need to tell Angular what to inject. Now, if you remember, when we inject something into a class, we use providers array in the metadata object of that class. For example, for a component, we use the metadata object of add component decorator. In the same way, for directives, we use metadata object of @directive decorator, and there we specify the providers array. But we do not have any metadata object for the service, right? And it is just the way Angular works that we need to attach a metadata object to a class where we want to inject something. So if we want to inject something in a service class, we have a special metadata for it, and that is @injectable. So in this user service class, we want to inject a dependency. We want to inject something. So this class we need to decorate with @injectable. And in order to use this @injectable, we also need to import it from angular/go. So at the top, let's go ahead and let's write this import statement. And what do we want to import? We want to import @injectable from @angular/go. Okay. So this @injectable, it tells Angular that now something can be injected in this service class. And it's important to understand that we don't need to use this @injectable on the service which we want to inject. For example, here we want to inject this logger service, an instance of this logger service inside this user service. So we don't need to use this @injectable on the logger service, because inside this logger service we don't want to inject anything. We want to inject something inside the user service. So that's why on that service we need to use this @injectable. Okay, so we need to use @injectable decorator on the service where we want to inject something, but not on the service which we want to inject. In simple terms, we can say that we use @injectable on the receiving service. In this case, the receiving service is this user service. It is this service inside which we want to receive an instance of logger service class. Alright, so what we have done so far? We have created a constructor. We have decorated this user service with @injectable. Now we need to provide this service somewhere. And the best place to provide a service, as we learned in our last lecture, is the module class. So here, let's go to this app module.ts file. There we have this app module class, which is decorated with this ng module decorator. And in there we have this providers array. So here we also want to provide logger service. And we know that when we provide a service on the module level, same instance of that service is available throughout the Angular application. That means same instance will be available in all the components, all the directives, and also all the services. So now, since we are providing this logger service from the app module, an instance of this logger service will be available inside this user service class. And in order to use that instance, first we need to tell Angular how it needs to inject that instance. In this case, we want Angular to inject that instance using this constructor. We want it to inject an instance of this logger service class to this logger parameter. And since we want to inject something inside a service class, we need to decorate that service class with @injectable decorator. This is very important to understand. And in this way, inside this logger parameter, we will have an instance of logger service class. And since we have used a private keyword in front of it, behind the scenes, a private parameter called logger will be created. So here we can access that logger property using this keyword. So here I can simply say this dot logger. And in this way, now we are not instantiating this logger service class explicitly. Instead, we are asking Angular to inject an instance of that logger service class, and we are using that instance in order to access this log message method. So I can go ahead and I can remove this line of code from here. Okay, with this, if we save the changes, if we go to the web page and let's go to this admin section, and there let's try to add a new user. So let's say I add John, his mail, let's say he is using quarterly subscription and he's inactive. When I click on this create user, you see that user has been added, and in here in the developer console we can also see the log message. A new user with name John with status inactive is added to user list. Okay, so the logging functionality is now working as expected. So in this way, we have injected an instance of logger service class inside this user service class. Now, one important point to note here is that, as I explained, we don't need to use this @injectable decorator on the service which is not going to receive any other service. But we need to use it on those services where we want to inject something. And technically that is 100% true. However, In newer versions of Angular, it is recommended that we always add at injectable on all the services. It technically makes no difference right now, but in future it might. So it's already a habit that you might get into, that you add at injectable on all your services. So what I will do is, I will add this at injectable decorator on all the services which we have created. I'm going to add this at injectable on this logger service also, even though we are not going to receive any dependency inside this service, but still we are going to decorate it with at injectable decorator. And in order to use this at injectable decorator, we also need to import it from Angular/Go. So let me go ahead and let me copy this import statement, and let me go ahead and let me add it here. Okay, and let's do the same thing for subscribe service as well. So let me copy these two lines, and let's go to subscribe service, and there also let me go ahead and let me decorate this subscribe service with at injectable decorator. And in order to use this at injectable decorator, we need to import it from Angular/Go. All right. So in order to inject a service inside another service, we need to follow three steps. In the first step, we tell Angular how to inject the service. For that, we are using the constructor. And since we want to inject a dependency inside a service class, on that service, we need to use at injectable. And then we also need to provide the service from somewhere. Currently, we are providing that service from the app module. But if you want, you can also provide this service on the root component, on the app component. And in that way also it will work. In this lecture, we are going to understand on a very high level what is Angular's injection token. We will also briefly understand how dependency injection works behind the scenes in Angular. So currently I'm in the user service class. And so far we have seen that we inject this service into a class by using a constructor. So in order to inject this logger service inside this user service class, what we are doing is we are creating a constructor. And using that constructor, we ask Angular to inject a service. Right. Now, if we take example of this user service, we are using this user service inside this user list component. So in here, we are injecting an instance of user service. Now, how are we injecting an instance of this user service? By using a constructor in the user list component class. And then we are also providing this user service from the app module. So if I go to app module, there we are providing that user service. Now, when we are providing this user service like this, or any service for that matter, this is just a syntactic sugar. This line is actually something more. So behind the scenes, what Angular does is it converts this line, basically the type here which we are specifying, into an object like this. And in that object, we will have two properties. The provide property, and it will be assigned with user service. So this user service is the type. And then it will also have a property called use class. And again, it will be assigned with user service. So this is how behind the scenes Angular work with the type of the service which we specify inside the providers array. So for example, when we specify the type of the service, behind the scenes it gets converted into an object. And in that object, we will have this provide. This property basically stores a unique identifier for registering the class, which we also call as token. And this token acts like a key. So the dependency injection system needs this key to locate the provider in the providers array. And this token can be either a type or a string or an instance of injection token. And we will see that later. So keep in mind that this provider basically stores a unique identifier, a token. And then we have this property use class. And using this use class, we are specifying which class needs to be instantiated for that token. As I mentioned, we are using this user service inside the admin component, and we are using it inside the user list component. So if we go to the web page, our application should still be working. Let me close this here, and let's go to admin section. And in there, let's try to create a new user. When I click on this create button, that user has been added, as you can see. So the functionality is still working. But now what we are doing is we are explicitly specifying a token for that service. Let me move these elements into a separate line so that it will be more readable and understandable. Now, as I mentioned, this unique identifier can be a type, a string value, or an injection token. So instead of using a type here, let's go ahead and let's use a string value. And here I will call this token as maybe user underscore service. Okay, with this, if I save the changes and if you go to the web page, let me go to this admin tab, and you see our admin tab is not displayed here. Let me open developer console and let's see if we have any error. And you will notice that here we have an error, and the error says no provider for user service. That's because here we have provided a new token for this provide property. But when we are using this service in the admin component or in the user list component, there, while injecting the service, Angular does not know the service with which token it has to inject here. So here, for this user service, we want to inject an instance of this user service class where the token is user service. So we need to tell that to Angular, and we can do that by using at inject decorator. So here I can use at inject decorator, and in order to use this at inject decorator, we also need to import it from angular/go. So let me also go ahead and let me import it here. Okay, and in here we need to specify that string value. So I'll go to this app module. From there I will copy this string value and I'll specify it here using this at inject decorator. So that error is gone. If I save the changes now and if we go to the web page and if I go to this admin tab, we still have this error. That's because we are using this user service at two places. We are using it in the admin component and we are also using it in the user list component. So there also we need to do the same thing. So again, first of all, I'll go ahead and I will import inject from Angular core, and then I'll decorate this parameter with at inject. So here it should be at inject. And in here, we need to specify the identifier name. So the identifier name here is user service. We copy this and let's go ahead and let's paste it here. Let's save the changes now. Let's go to the web page again and let's go to admin section now. And that error is gone. Okay. And let's quickly check the functionality here. Here, I'll specify the name as John. John is male. Let's say subscription type is quarterly and he's an active user. When I click on this create button, that user has been added and the logger service has also been executed. So now the functionality is working. And this time, as a unique identifier, we are using a string value for this user service. Okay, so this string, it is nothing more than a unique identifier because everything that we are going to inject, it must be unique for the injector. But the problem with using a string value as a unique identifier is that it is prone to errors. When we use a string token, it is easier to mistype and it makes difficult to track and maintain it in big applications. And this is where injection tokens comes into picture. So instead of using a string value, what we can do is we can use injection tokens. So first we will have to create those tokens. For example, here, let's go ahead and let's create a new injection token. For that, what I will do is I'll say export const and let's call this token as user underscore token. Now, in order to create the token, we use new keyword and we instantiate injection token class. Okay. And to use this injection token, let's go ahead and let's import it from angular/go. Okay. And in here, we also need to specify the type. So here, the type is going to be user service. And in here, we need to pass a string value. That string value can be used to describe what this token is going to do. So here, I'll simply say user underscore service. But this string can be anything. Okay, it does not matter. And in this way, we are creating a unique user token for this user service class. And now we can go ahead and we can use this user token instead of that string value. So in here, we can use that user token. And we also need to change it in the admin component where we are using this at inject decorator. So now there we are not using any string value. Instead, we are using an injection token. So we need to specify that injection token here. And same thing we also need to do here. And here it says cannot find name user token. That's because we have defined this user token in the app module, right? We're defining this user token here. And since we are exporting it from here, we can go ahead and we can import it in this file. So here we can write import statement, and we want to import injection token from. So we need to move one folder up, and then we have this app module file. So from here, we need to import this user token. Let's write the same input statement in this user list component as well. Okay, here we need to move one more folder up. So I'll use dot dot slash one more time. Now let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page, and all right, let's go to this admin section. We don't have any error. Let's try to create a new user just to check if the functionality is working or not. So the functionality is still working. The user has been added, and we also see this log message. A new user with name Mary and status active is added to the user list. So the logger service is also working. So this was a very high level overview of what is injection tokens in Angular and how behind the scenes Angular dependency injection works. Now if we want, we can do the same thing for this subscribe service and also this logger service, but I'm not going to do that. Now before I wrap up this lecture, I also want to cover two more things. The first thing is, if I go to this user service class, on that we are using this at injectable, right? And then what we are doing is we are providing this service in the app module. We are providing it here. In the same way, we have other services. So we have this logger service, and on this logger service also we are using this at injectable, and we are providing this service in the app module. Now instead of doing it like that, what we can also do is if I go to this logger service class, and before that let me close this admin component and user list component. So what we can do is in here to this at injectable decorator, we can pass an object, and here we can specify a property provided in, and to that we can assign root. And this simply means that we want to provide this logger service from the app module. And when we write it like this, in that case, we don't have to provide that service explicitly in the app module. So here I can go ahead and I can remove this service from here. We don't need to provide it anymore from the app module class, because when we are creating that service and when we have decorated it with at injectable decorator, there itself we are telling that we want to provide this logger service from the root, from the app module. So this line simply means that we want to provide this service from app module. And in that case, we don't have to explicitly do that by specifying this logger service inside this providers array of app module. So if we save the changes, and let's quickly check if the logger functionality is working or not. So I'll go to this admin page, and in here I'll create a new user, maybe Steve, his mail, let's say subscription type is quarterly and he is active. When I click on this create button, you see that user has been added and the log message is also added. So the logger service is still working. That means this logger service is still being provided from somewhere. And that somewhere is nothing but app module. Even though we have not specified it explicitly here, but when we say provided in as root, we say that we want to provide this service from app module. So this is one thing which I wanted to cover. So let me close this logger service file. Let me also close this app module. And let's close this user service as well. And now what I will do is I will go to home component. In there we have this hero component and sidebar component. So let me open any one of these component, maybe hero component. So I'll go to hero component.ts file, and in there we have our hero component class. Now in that class, when we want Angular to inject an instance of a service, for that what we are doing is we are creating a constructor, and using that constructor we want Angular to inject a service inside its parameter, right? So this is one way we can do it. And there is also a new way in which we can ask Angular to inject a service. So instead of using a constructor like this, what we can do is we can create a property, maybe let's again call it subservice. And to that, we can call a method called inject. Now, in order to use this method, we also need to import it from Angular/Co. Okay, and in here, we need to specify the type of instance which we want to be injected inside this service. And the type of service which we want to be injected here is subscribe service. So we can go ahead and we can specify that. So this is also how we can ask Angular to inject a service inside a class. Instead of creating a constructor like this, we can do something like this, where we can use this inject method. So this inject method, it has been introduced in Angular 14. So this is another way how we can ask Angular to inject a service inside a class. So if we save the changes, if we go to the web page, let's quickly check if we have any error, and we do have an error here. And the error is property subservice does not exist on type hero component. Let me go back. Oh, I have misspelled the name here, the property name. So let me rename it to subservice. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to the web page again. And now that error is gone, let me close this console. And we have added that inject method inside hero component. So let me click on this subscribe now button and let's see if the functionality is working or not. So when I click on the subscribe button, you see that functionality is still working. We still see that alert window. But now, instead of using a constructor for injecting the instance, now we are using this inject method. So far in this section, we have learned about services and dependency injection in great detail. Now, in the very first lecture of this section, we learned that we can use services for component interaction. And with services, interaction between two components, two non-related components is very easy. And that's what we are going to see in this lecture. In this lecture, we will learn how we can pass data from one component to another component using services in Angular. And to understand this, in the UI, I have done few changes. So if I open this source folder and if I open this app folder, let's go to this header folder. And in there, we have our admin component. And in the admin component, I have created a new component called user detail. And if I expand this user detail component, and if you go to the HTML of this user detail component, here we have a very simple HTML. Currently, we are hard coding some value here. So this is the first change. I have created a new component called user detail. And the second change is in the user list component. If I go to HTML of this user list component, there I have also added one button element. So this is the second change. And if you notice, this user list component and this user detail component, these are sibling components. They do not have a parent-child relationship. So if I go to the web page and if you go to this admin page, there you will notice that for each user detail, we have this plus button. And if I scroll down, we are also displaying the detail of the user. So this detail we are displaying from user detail component. And currently in there, we are hard coding these values. But now what we want is, whenever the plus button of any one of these users is clicked, we want to show that user's detail here. Okay, so for example, if I click on this plus button, then the details of Steve Smith should be displayed here. If I click on this plus button, then the details of Mary Jane should be displayed here. And again, we are displaying this user list in the user list component. And we are displaying the details of the user in the user detail component. So here what we want is, when this click event on this button element happens in the user list component, we want to display data in the user detail component. Let's see how we can achieve that. For that, the first thing which we are going to do is, on this button, we are going to bind click event. So let's go to VS Code, and on this button element, let's go ahead and let's bind click event. And whenever this click event happens, we want to call a method, maybe show user details. Let's go ahead and let's create this method in our component class. So let's go to user list component.ts, and in there, let's go ahead and let's create this method. And it should be show user details. Let's change the spelling mistake here as well. Okay. All right. Here what we want is, when this show user details method is called, we want to call an event, and from that event, we want to emit the details of that particular user. Now, where do we have our users? We have our users in the user service, right? So let's first see what is the error we have here. So the method name is show user details. Let me copy this method and let me paste it here. All right. So let's go to our user service. And for that, we need to go to this services folder, and there we have our user service. So in this user service, we already have this get all users method and create user method. Now what I want is, in here, I want to create an event. I'm going to call this event on user details clicked. Okay, so this is going to be an event. And if you remember, in order to create an event, we use event emitter. And in order to use this event emitter, we need to import it from Angular/Go. So in here, let's go ahead and let's import it from Angular/Go. And then inside these angle brackets, we need to specify the type of the data which this event is going to emit. Now here, this event is going to emit a user detail. So here, the type is going to be user. Okay. And then in order to create an event emitter, we need to instantiate it. For that, we can use this new keyword followed by event emitter. Again, here also we need to specify the type of data we are going to emit. That is going to be of type user. Okay, and here we don't need to use this set of parentheses. All right, so here we are creating an event. Now we might also want to emit this event. So for that, we are going to create a method. I'm going to call this method on show user details. Okay, and from within this method, first we are going to access that event, and the name of the event is on user details clicked. And on that, we are going to call emit method in order to emit that event. And when that event is emitted, what do we want to do? We want to emit a user detail. So let's say we are going to get that user detail when this method will be called. So whoever will call this on show user details method, it has to pass the value for that user object. So here I'm going to call it as user, and again it is going to be of type user class. All right. So what we have done so far, in the user service class, we have created an event and we are emitting that event using this on show user details method. Now, when do we want to emit this event? We want to emit this event whenever a user clicks on this plus button. So basically, we want to emit this event from within this show user details method. For that, we are already getting an instance of this user service class here inside this user service property. So here we will say this dot user service dot, and there we have this method on show user details. Okay. Now here we also need to pass the value for the user object, the user object for which the user has clicked the plus button. So for that, let's go back to the view template. Let's go to user list component.html. And when we are calling this click method, there we will have that user object because we are looping over this user list. And for each iteration, we will have this user object. So we are going to pass that user object to this show user details method. So let me go ahead and let me pass this user object to that method. And in the component class, let's also specify a parameter here. Let's call it user. It is going to be of type user class. Now, in order to use this user class inside this user list component, we need to import it. So let's go ahead and let's import it. And now let's pass this user parameter to this on show user details method. And when we are calling this on show user details method of this user service, what it is going to do, it is going to emit this event. And when this event is emitted, we want to emit the data which we are going to receive for this user object. So let's go ahead and let's emit it from here. Again, let me recap what we have done so far. So what we have done is, on this button, we have added click event. Whenever the click event will happen, we are calling the show user details method. And to that method, we are passing the current user object for which this button has been clicked. Then in the show user details method, what we are doing is we are calling this on show user details method of user service. And there also we are passing the current user object for which the button has been clicked. Now, if we go to this user service, there inside this on show user details method, we are emitting this on user details clicked event. And when this event is being emitted, we are emitting the details of the user for which the plus button has been clicked. So basically, we are emitting the details of selected user. Now we want to display the details of that user in this user detail component, right? So in the user detail component, what we are going to do is we are first going to create a property. I'll call it user, or maybe I'll call it selected user. It is going to be of type user. So again, in order to use this user class, we need to import it from this file. Now I'm also going to implement ng on init method here. Okay. And since we are using this ng on init method here, let me go ahead and let me implement on init interface. And in order to use this on init interface, we need to import it from angular/go. All right. So what we want to do is inside this user details component, we want to subscribe to this on user details clicked event. So whenever this event happens, whenever this event is emitted, we want this user detail component class to be notified about that. For that, we need to subscribe to that event. And to subscribe to that event, first of all, we need to create an instance of this user service class. Now, instead of creating that instance explicitly, what we will do is we will ask Angular to inject an instance of this user service class inside this user detail class. For that, again, I'll create a property. I'll call it user service. And here, in order to tell Angular that it has to inject an instance of user service class here, I'm going to use inject method. And in order to use this inject method, we also need to import it from angular/go. And there, let's specify the type as user service. Okay. And in order to use this user service, again, we need to import it from this file. So in this way, we will have an instance of this user service class inside this user service property. Now using that instance, let's say this dot user service dot, and inside this user service, we have an event called on user details clicked, and we want to subscribe to that event. Okay, so basically, whenever this event is emitted, this user detail component class will be notified about it. And that will happen because we are subscribing to that event. Now here, behind the scenes, the concept of observable is being used. Basically, whenever this event will happen, it is going to emit an observable. And we are subscribing to that observable. But I will not go into details of observable here because we have not talked about it yet. And we are going to talk about it in the future lectures of this course. But for now, just understand that here we are subscribing to this event inside this user detail component class. Now, since we have subscribed to this event using this subscribe method, whenever this event will be raised, we know that it is going to emit the user details, right? So whenever this event will be raised, since we have subscribed to it, we will get that data as an argument to the callback function, which we can pass to this subscribe method. So to this subscribe method, we can pass a callback function, and this callback function will be executed whenever this event will be raised. So when this event will be raised, it is going to emit some data. Basically, it is going to emit the user detail. So we are going to receive that user detail as an argument to this callback function. And we know that the type of that data is going to be user. It is going to be of type user class, right? So now inside this callback function, we can simply go ahead and we can set the selected user. So for that, we can say this dot selected user equal to this data, because we know that inside this data parameter, we are going to receive a user detail. Okay, so with that user detail, we are setting this selected user property. Now, just to check if it is working, let's simply go ahead and let's log this selected user. Let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me open developer console and let me clear everything here. Let's go to admin tab. And here we have an error and it says no provider for user service. And we have this error because if you remember in the last lecture, we had specified an injection token for this user service. So if I go to app module, you see there we are specifying this user token. So this user token is basically the injection token for this service. So now we need to use this user token inside this user detail component. So let's go ahead and let's import that user token from app module. And let's go ahead and let's use this user token instead of user service. And now if we go to the web page and if I go to this admin tab, Now we don't have any error. Let me clear the console here and let me click on this plus button. So you will notice that a user object has been logged with the details of the selected user. So currently I have selected the first user. So the details of that user has been displayed here. If I click on the last user, this Mark Tyler, then the details of that user has been logged here. Okay, so what is happening here is whenever this plus button is being clicked in the user service, this event is being raised. And whenever this event is being raised, it is going to emit the details of the user which we have selected. Okay, and we are logging that in the user detail component here. So now we don't want to log it here. Instead, we want to show the detail in the UI. For that, we are going to make use of this selected user property. So if we go to the view template of this user detail component, there what we want is, instead of using these hard-coded values, we want to use the selected user property. Okay, and this selected user is going to have a name property. So we want to use that name property. Let me copy this syntax from here. And here I want to use the gender property of that selected user. Then here I want to use the subtype property of that selected user. Okay, and here I want to use the status property of that selected user. Okay, so we know that each user is going to have a name property, a gender property, the subtype property, and status property. Now for the image, what I want is, here I want to use property binding, and in there I want to set the avatar image based on the gender. So first of all, I will wrap this complete thing within single quotes like this, and this value here, it should change based on the gender. So here, instead of saying male, what I will do is I will use two single quotes. I'll use this plus, and in there I'll specify the gender property, selected user dot gender. Okay, let's see if it works or not. So let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let me close this console. Let's go to this admin tab and let me scroll down a little bit. So currently, if you see, no user has been selected, so no details is being displayed here. But when I click on this plus button of one of the users, the details of that user has been displayed. If I click on this user, the details of that user has been displayed. And if I click on this plus button, the details of the last user has been displayed. Now, for some reason, the avatar image is not coming here. Let's check why is that. And I think that's because this gender, it is going to have its first letter in uppercase. So what we will do is we will convert this gender to all lowercase. For that, we will use this to lowercase method. Now let's save the changes and let's see if it has fixed that issue. So let me click on this one, and now you can see that avatar image is also coming. If I select this user who is a female, then for that user, the female avatar image is coming. So now it is working. Now what I also want is, initially when there is no user selected, I don't want to display this component at all. So for that, let's go back to VS Code, and there, first of all, let me remove this div because we are not using it. Okay, and here I will use ng if directive, and to that I will assign selected user. Okay, so if no user is selected, in that case this selected user will be undefined, and undefined is a falsy value. So in that case, this div will not be displayed. But if some user is selected, in that case, that will not be a falsy value, that will be a truthy value. In that case, this div will be displayed. Let's quickly verify if it is working or not. So let's go to this admin page, and initially that component has not been rendered. Let me click on the first user. So now the details of that user is being displayed. If I click on third user, the details of third user has been displayed. If I click on second user, the details of second user has been displayed. But initially when the page loads, at that time, since no user is selected, now that component is not being displayed. So this functionality is also working. So as you can see, passing data from one component to another component using services is quite easy. In this example, let me close this HTML file, and let me also close this user list component HTML. So in this example, what we wanted is, we wanted to pass data from user list component to user detail component. Basically, when the click event will happen in the user list component, we want to display the details of the clicked user in the user detail component. And this user detail and user list, they are sibling components. They do not have parent-child relationship. But we wanted to pass data between the user list component and user detail component. Here, we are going to select the user in the user list component. And we want to display the details of that selected user in the user detail component. For that, we needed to pass the selected user from the user list component to the user detail component. And for that, we made use of services. All we did is, inside the service, we created an event and we are raising that event using this onShowUserDetails method. And where are we calling this onShowUserDetails method? We are calling this method whenever in the user list component a user is selected. That means the plus button of any user list is clicked. So when that plus button is clicked, we are binding this showUserDetails method to that click event. And from within this method, we are basically calling this onShowUserDetails method, which is going to raise this onUserDetails clicked event. And when this event is raised, we are emitting the selected user data. Now, in the user detail component, what we are doing is we are subscribing to that event. So whenever this event will be raised, whenever this event will happen, since we have subscribed to that event, this component will get a notification that that event has occurred. And it will also get the data which that event has emitted. And we are assigning that data to the selected user property. And in this way, using services, we can communicate between any two components, whether they are related or not, in a very simple way. Alright, so this was all about services and dependency injection in Angular. I hope this section has been useful for you and you learned a lot from this section. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.